and he's born in Northern Ireland. Michael Tsarion is an expert on occult histories of Ireland and America, and he's made the deepest researches into Atlantis, origins of evil, and into the Irish origins of civilization. He's the author of the acclaimed book Atlantis, Alien Visitation and Genetic Manipulation, and is the producer and presenter of Origins and Oracles, a DVD series which explores ancient mysteries and forbidden knowledge. Michael gives outstanding presentations on the following subjects: Western magical tradition, the Hermetic arts of divination, Atlantis and prehistoric ages, Ireland and the Druids, astrotheology, the origins of evil, secret societies, war on consciousness, subversive use of sacred symbolism, symbol literacy, and psychic vampirism. But you're very prolific, and there's so many different avenues and interests that you have that I didn't even know where to begin to start, other than to let you get started on where you'd like to go.
Well, Jim Keith was certainly a big inspiration for me because, as I said, his books were so upfront and so incredible, full of information about something that's very, very important. And he basically was a student of mind control in all of its forms. He did talk about the radiotronic aspect of it, getting into the frequency, the way the frequencies are used, both microwave and both other. He got into MK Ultra, he got into Project Monarch, and he really showed how mind control has been used. I had already been studying how whole nations had been systematically mind controlled, you see, over millennia, as a matter of fact, certainly hundreds of years.
Uh-huh.
And so I wanted to get more deeper into that, because, of course, what do we have today? We have so much interest right now on mind control.
Okay.
And we have so much interest on technology and where we're going with that. It's a big, worry. But what is happening a lot in the conspiracy movement, or the alternative research movement, and it's been going on for quite a while, but it's been going more since 9/11, is a lot of us versus them type of scenario, in the sense that a lot of writers and researchers still remain within the frame of blaming some sort of, hidden elite or whatever, and of course there is a hidden elite. It's important to know about them, and it's important to find out what they're doing. But my work tends to also bear in mind and stresses it's not just a case of, some evil, overarching, predatory force. It's also what we might be doing, what ordinary human beings are doing to, number one, vote these people into power, to give away our own power to these people, and what it might be in the consciousness of human beings that makes them submit. And when you look into the whole question of submission, and when you look into the whole question of slavery, you're not talking about something recent, you're talking about something quite ancient. It goes back through the Middle Ages, it goes back to the birth of Christianity, and beyond even that. So this question of mind control is not just a modern thing. So where the Jim Keith was, focusing a lot on the individual and how individuals might be mind controlled when they unfortunately come under the power or control of the military, you see, or these men in white. My work tended to take what Jim Keith was talking about and then really apply it across the board again to show that, man can very much have his habitat manipulated and transformed, and he won't be able to see that. And what about societies? What about the sociological implications of this kind of mass control? And again, trying to a little bit veer away from the idea that it's just some hidden them. Because when you get into that, if you just sit around and sort of bash, the Illuminati or the White Brotherhood or the Freemasons or whatever, the trouble with that, the flip side of that, is that breeds paranoia. That breeds fear. That breeds a lot of fear-mongering, a lot of unnecessary finger-pointing, and basically a lot of paranoia. And if you've studied, what's going on in the conspiracy movement today, you'll see that paranoia is rampant. It's heated up since 9/11. It also creates a lot of divisionalism. Anytime you're into an us and them situation, that tends to not be very holistic. It tends to put people into boxes. It divides people. And even though it's very legitimate to realize that there's a war on consciousness and there is a hand that is working day and night to keep people under control, how far can you go along that road, you see, of just keep pointing fingers? So it's time, I think, to also bear in mind how man himself, what it is in the psychology of ordinary human beings that makes them prey to this problem, because it's an age-old problem. And even if we don't talk about tyranny or control or submission on the social, governmental level, we can even talk about it in relationships. I mean, when we start talking about how men and women submit, we don't even have to go much further than the place of work or the relationships that people are in. This thing is really close to home. So it's something that one needs to look at, how the parents treat their children, how we treat animals in nature, how women have been treated down through the generations. This whole question of the master-slave is not simply reserved to, the corridors of power. It's something that happens within religion, within relationships, within the place of work, as I said. It's everywhere. So it's a tremendous study, and it's very, very important that we start to adjust our settings so that we start to look at also what it is within human beings that allows them to become slaves. Because, as we said in the DVD, somebody can sell you something rotten, but you don't have to buy it. So if we see that people are buying it, we also want to address that question.
And what made you get started in this direction?
I think what got started is probably growing up in Northern Ireland and seeing this particular kind of, jackboot regimentation, this kind of cliqueism, as I said before. We might call it sectarianism, and we see it. Look at it now. We've got the Jews against the Muslims, even though the patriarch or the founding father of what by their own words, Judaism is based on the patriarch Abraham and Jacob and Isaac and all of that. And is not Abraham also the patron of the Muslims? Don't the Muslims also say that their Quran and their teachings is based on the teachings of Abraham? So how can you have the same patriarchs? How can you acknowledge that the same fathers spawned and created your religions and yet be always murdering each other down the line? Is that something sane, you say?
No.
Don't forget that half of my family is from India, so we've also dealt with enormous colonization there. Mm-hmm. We're talking about a lot of doublespeak. We're talking about every empire today, whether it's the Belgians, the French, the Portuguese, you see the English, and even the Americans. Look at America now. America now is basically an aristocracy. It's a new empire. Their policies are imperialistic. So, we have colonization and colonialization still going on today, as bad as it was at the time of Queen Victoria, as at the time it was during the Romans, as it was during Alexander the Great, and all the way back through time. Nothing changes. And how I got started, you see, is I've always been interested in the mystical questions. My interest in politics is an occult interest. It stems from metaphysics. It stems from the whole metaphysical question of why is it that men and women don't change? They may have more perks, they may have more superficial pastimes and escapes. But is man psychologically different than he was back in the Middle Ages? When it comes to the father figure, and when it comes to the questions of submission and slave-master relationship, and when it comes to the attraction-repulsion dynamics, very little has actually changed in a way. Man has remained very primitive psychologically. And to me, all these other fascinating things that we study in the conspiracy movement are brilliant, and I love it, and I've done a lot of work on those before, done writings and DVDs. But always underneath it, you see, is this whole question of man's psychology, because it's his psychological temperament and it's a psychological complexion that leaves him open to all kinds of submission. As I said, if it's in a personal relationship or if it goes further up the scale through the governmental level. There's so many things we could get into that we're going to get into, but one of them was this whole thing again of how the ego is constructed, how consciousness is constructed. And one of the most interesting things comes out of the work of Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud was the first man to basically show that there's an anatomy of consciousness or an anatomy of thinking. Meaning that, just like we know we've got 2 arms and 2 legs and a head, and we know the physical anatomy of people, what about the anatomy of man's mind, consciousness? Is there anatomy of thinking? And so Freud went into this, and basically, to make it simple for people, he basically had a tripartite system. He divided consciousness into about 3 basic parts. One was the unconscious, of course, which he called id. In German, the word id is almost like our English word it. So he didn't even name the unconscious. The unconscious is basically unnameable. And in German, he just called it the it, this mysterious place where the lights are turned off, where we go when we sleep, dream time, where the people like the Aboriginals, you see, are talking about the dream time. And the big question is that the spiritual realm? Now, here's an interesting side point before I go on, and that is that in English, the American APA, and this involves also the English translators of Freud, always toned down drastically his spiritual connotations to his findings. In German, the words are deeply meaningful in a spiritual context. But when his books were translated, even the covers of his book, even the names and titles of the book were drastically changed in order to make it more materialistic than Freud ever wanted it to be. They wanted to make it more Pavlovian. They wanted to make his teachings more behavioral. In other words, a certain propaganda was used in the mere translations of Freud. So basically what I'm saying is that when people read about Freud or they pick up a dictionary, generally what we've heard about Freud, even taught from the schools, is actually not very accurate. He's made into this, supreme atheist or, a person who had no sort of a metaphysical interest and all of these kinds of things. And of course, this is absolutely not true. But getting back to our point, he did believe that the unconscious was a spiritual sort of realm. There was something there that, might have been of a spiritual nature, something deep and something rich, as well as the idea that he also believed that the unconscious is a sort of a dumping ground for all of the stuff that we don't like about ourselves. He came up with the word repression. And repression is simply the things about life, and much more importantly, the things about ourselves that we don't like, we repress into the unconscious. The second part of his tripartite breakdown of consciousness was, of course, the ego. He basically came up with that word, ego consciousness. This is the part where the lights are on. This is what gives us our awareness. This is what turns on when we wake up in the morning, and so forth. And then there was a third part, a very important third division, which is called the superego. And the superego is like the big daddy. It's the policeman within. It's the part of us that is our moral sensibility, what he also called the conscience, and what today is commonly called the conscience of a person. Because it's one thing having an ego, but we know there are many psychopaths in the world. So it's the superego, this part of the ego that developed out of the ego, that's like a sort of administrator, like a sort of a headmaster within consciousness. And this is the kind of inner, almost godlike voice that reprimands us when we do bad things. So in the LA talk that I did, I was saying that this superego is itself divided into two. So we have the three parts of Freud's, schemata, which is the unconscious, the ego, and the superego. But the superego itself is divided into two drives. One is known as the prohibitive drive, and the other one is the permissive drive. And you find that the superego's first representatives or first programming is with the parents. So a child is what is known as polymorphously perverse. What that means is that a child has no morality when it's born. It has no concept at all about good and bad. It's in a state of animism or autism, in which it's so in its own mind. A child is more driven by the unconscious. These things like the ego and the superego haven't developed strongly yet. So the parents are there to teach the child what is right and what is wrong. And of course, it goes without saying that the parents are the representative of the world, right? The parents themselves have learned what is right and wrong from their parents and from going to work and from seeing, the representatives of the law and learning the hard way, often, what is right and what is wrong. And their duty is then to teach these sort of virtues and morals to the child. Well, the interesting thing about this is when you take this particular psychic scheme up or down, whatever way you want to look at it, to the political level, you find the same thing in operation there. For instance, to make it clear for people, look at the Republican versus the Democrat, you see, or let's say the conservative versus the socialist type of person, the liberal type of person. What you're actually seeing there is a playing out of what is going on within man's consciousness. In other words, the political sphere of operation is precisely based on this primal unconscious mental setup. And so, like I was saying earlier to you in the beginning, how can we break the tyranny, you see, unless we know its roots? And my philosophy is that the roots of all tyranny are within consciousness. And here I'm just giving you a perfect example of this, that when we see this so-called permissive, which would be the liberal, people can split hairs over this, but just in general, we have the liberal attitude in the political milieu, and we have the more conservative, restrictive, punitive, you see, prohibitive side. And it's fascinating to see that these two wings in the political sphere are absolutely based upon how man's own consciousness works. And so that really basically is a huge giveaway as to what is really going on here. And that it's thinking itself, and it's man's matrix, you see, that brings into being all the different kinds of phenomena that we find in government. We know that, for instance, another little angle to this is the relationship that Western so-called civilized man has habitually had down through the centuries with so-called uncivilized tribes. Okay, let's take that. It's a well-known fact. History is replete in it. We've had endless shows on TV and PBS about how Western, powers colonized Africa, how blacks were treated, how pygmies were treated, how the Indians were treated, during the time of Queen Victoria, how the Vietnamese were treated by the French, the Belgians, I believe the Portuguese and the English. They were like so colonized, it's not even funny. But in everywhere that you find this kind of imperialistic drive, hasn't the black man or hasn't the dark man always been considered sort of like a primitive, a subspecies? And the white man, from the West has also been considered sort of superior? Again, Freud and Jung would say, well, that is again based on the unconscious, based on the way that the mind is working, where everything that's in the light, everything that has standards, everything that appears to be modern and progressive is aligned with the frontal lobes, is aligned with the ego, and everything that is not, and which appears sort of, free form and feminine and maybe primitive, right, is attached to people's unconscious. And so as we've moved down as human beings through the millennia, we have developed greater walls within ourselves between the conscious and the unconscious worlds. Modern man today is very cut off from his unconscious. That's the way society also, it's one of the downsides of living in civilization and society. That through the schooling and through the different forms of regimentation, you see, this right brain, free-flowing, imaginative, creative, spontaneous drives, these complexes, this kind of expression is cut off. That has a worldly component. As I said, it's in the schism between, say, civilized and non-civilized people. But we don't even have to look globally for that. We don't even have to look, north and south of the equator. These kinds of prejudices exist even within nations. We have all sorts of prejudices. I mean, my goodness, anybody who's gone to India knows fine rightly that the most racist people on the face of this earth live in India, to the point where they even have a caste system where certain people are considered untouchable. And believe me, untouchable is not the lowest class. I mean, in Hinduism, you've got even lower than that. So what could be more reprehensible, you see? And this again, no matter where you go, from what corner of the earth, no matter under what religion people are hiding, no matter under what sort of, veneer of civilization people are hiding, we have these prejudices. They're in every single country. And this is what is causing the various divisions you see between people. Because it's again based on man not being integrated within. So nothing political is truly political. But nothing external is really external. It's all based on what we are inside ourselves. The more and more man gets alienated from his own unconscious. Some people believe the unconscious is the spiritual realm. Others would, say no, it's not. But it really doesn't matter. The point is that the creative wellspring from which we arise, from which consciousness itself arises, is the unconscious. And if you get too cut off from it, you end up being a stranger to yourself. And you can see that our whole Western civilization is based on having people live entirely on the surface of themselves. And you only have to look at the media to realize just how, incredibly much there's an interest in having people just decorate their persona at the cost of all of their other aspects and selves. We're not interested in people anymore, what they are inside deeper. People are just forced to live in the ego and in the narcissistic drives, you see, and pulling further and further away from their own core, further and further away from their own unconscious. That becomes the way he lives in society, So if you look at the design of cities, the design of skyscrapers, you look at the fluorescent lighting, you see, even in many offices now, and this whole emphasis of the square and the cube, and this whole emphasis on regimentation in so many ways, whether it's at Starbucks. I don't know if people have observed any of this. Often they haven't observed any of this. They're not even remotely aware of just how regimented and formalized just the average living is, you see. And this whole penchant for franchises and the design of cities being based on the grid and all of these kinds of things. It's so ubiquitous we don't notice it. But unfortunately the psychologists do notice it. And they know that it's not healthy, it's not right. And again, it's predicated upon human beings. History actually moves in interesting phases. Just like we talked about the prohibitive and the permissive, it turns out that in history you also have waves. It's like a rhythm, a moving rhythm in which some ages are more permissive and some ages are more prohibitive. And it almost has a pattern to it. Like, for instance, back in the 1960s in America, right? That would be a permissive era in which suddenly the liberal modality is in and you're able to, go about and do what you want. And, it's considered unfashionable to be a straight person, up and down, and going to work on all of these things. There's a huge conflict there. Because in the 1950s it was quite different. And if you watch a movie, for instance, like The Graduate, with Dustin Hoffman, That whole movie explores this particular dynamic of the changeover between, the prohibitive to the permissive life and the conflict and stress that often comes with that. It's about a young man, you see, who is trying to make this choice between doing what his parents want. And then after the 60s, what happened again? We had another spate of conservatism, tremendous conservatism coming around in the 80s, you see. Mm-hmm. And then again, it would be followed with a period of the punk rock era came in, and then it's a bit more liberalness, you see, and a little bit more free form again, a little bit more what they call Dionysian. And then again, that's followed up by another Apollonian period, which was the time of the computer nerds. And then after that, you get again, some more permissiveness with the rap sort of music and the heavy metal and the rock and roll coming back in. And then again, with the Bush administrations, you see tremendous crackdown again and the rise of fundamental Christianity and stuff like this. So when a psychologist looks at history or sociology, and when you look even closer at the movement of government, you start to see this particular psychological scheme playing itself out in the world. And it's just incredible to see this. So that people start looking into this and start to get savvy at this greater movement and not just get caught into the stereotypical action and lose track of this incredible movement in history, which, as I said, is again, articulated to man's thinking, his consciousness. Whatever is in his mind finds its way out onto the world in this incredibly fascinating way. We could be positively heading towards a period of much greater freedom. There's talk of the age of Aquarius, for instance, you see? So on paper, mankind could be heading for the most freedom he's ever had before. And I mean that also not just physically, but spiritually. There is a chance that man's consciousness is at the stage now where, we have so much information now about permaculture, alternative living, survival, free energy. We've got all the tools and all the knowledge at our hands, which wasn't there before. So my interest in these things is that, look, Big Brother doesn't just sit there waiting to be overthrown. As I've said, these people, these architects of control, have tremendous knowledge of these things. They know both astrologically where we're going, and they also have fingers on the pulse of man's psyche. So they're obviously not interested in people waking up. And from what I've said already, you can tell that awakening could be a really marvelous thing. It would mean throwing off the shackles of all forms of religious and political control. Man has been, whether he likes it or not, moving towards this because it's natural to move towards this. Nature wants the human being to move towards this. There's a spirit within people that wants freedom, as buried as it is. In all my work, what I try to show people is that you already would have freedom. You already would have a paradisical lifestyle. It's just that there's many weights and impediments on top, and they've been put there on purpose to keep you down. And what we're seeing now, then, you see, is a great sort of almost critical mass in which the forces of Big Brother are really threatened by what might be coming. They've read it in the stars, so to speak. And so they're pulling out all the stops to prevent that from taking place. And this kind of movement of theirs has many, many tentacles. It's about dividing and ruling more, which you've seen, haven't you, since the Bushes came in? Not that they were the first, but hasn't there been so much more emphasis on schism and dividing?
Right.
And causing conflict throughout the world, you see? Yes, there's movements of acquisition. There's movements to create conflict. This is one of the areas. There's more of a control of the media than there has ever been before. So much so that, even a person with a single brain cell can see that it's just consensus all the way. You see? We have a surveillance.
Isn't it kind of a dualistic thing that they're doing? Because you're saying that at the same time that we have all this war and this division, but at the same time all you're hearing is them talking about a one world order. That's
right. And, well, the one world order has not just been spoken of recently. This is something that's been, age old. It's really age old. That's why they put it in Latin on the dollar bill. There's a reason why it's not in English, it's in Latin, because the New World Order is something that goes through, back to the Roman Empire. All oligarchs, all royal houses, all these globalists have always tried to bring this. Adolf Hitler tried it. His second book was even called The World Order, you see. So this has been on the mind of all psychopaths. Because, as I was saying originally, my biggest concern is not that technology is bad, it's that technology in the wrong hands. Technology in the hands of the psychopath is what we need to figure out. And so the DVD series is absolutely, when it's finished, it will be literally an encyclopedia of the psychopath. So that no one on this planet can ever look to these people again and imagine that they're sane. or give their allegiance, you see, because we've defined in the architects of control, we're defining what the psychopath is. We see that technology has the potential of doing great evil in the world, but also great good. And we're not saying that government is all bad. Government originally was a thing for the people. But state control is bad. And also, religion or politics or technology in the hands of maniacs or psychopaths or megalomaniacs, you see, is obviously a recipe for disaster. And remember that these architects of control don't like freedom. They're toxic people inside. They don't have a harmonious psychology. They have a pathology. They're infected by many, many mental disorders.
In the way that they conduct their business and whatever with the corporation as its as the paradigm, that's a psychopathic entity in its own right, is it not?
Absolutely right. And this is what Joel Bakan wrote in his book, The Corporation, and also he showed in his DVD of The Corporation. You see, even the word corp means deaf. In Latin, it means a dead body, like a corpus. So there's something dead, there's something necrotic, there's something lifeless, there's something zombieite about even behind the idea of corporation, a body. It's a body of something. But is it a live body? Is it something that acts upon rational standards? Of course not. These things are exploitatory. These things are not sustainable. And just like any state edifice, their whole modus operandi is basically confiscation and extortion. It's the same with the federal system in America, and it's the same with the banks in England. It's all over the world. It's the same with the World Bank, the IMF, you name it. So this is what comes out of a pathology. But of course, when somebody like Joel Bakan is saying that a corporation is psychopathic, of course what he really means is that it's the people who have created and run those corporations are psychopathic. That's what he really means. And so it's people again. And we seem to, it's a strange quirk of civilization, that all the worst psychopaths that could possibly exist, we tend to promote into the positions of the greatest power. The Winston Churchills, the Joseph Stalins, the Vladimir Lenins, the George Bushes or whoever it might be. The list is endless. I mean, it's absolutely endless. Going back to Charlemagne and, the Duke of Wellington, whoever all the maniacs, Oliver Cromwell, and so many other psychopaths. These are the people who somehow, rise to the top, and they are able to then steer the ship of state. And this is the tragedy, you see, that the great voices and the great teachers, they're not promoted. They're actually suppressed, if anything. And over time, the psychopaths who have the control, they are not happy in a healthy, organic, living, creative, flowing, spontaneous type of setup. That's very threatening to them. So that's where the regimentation is coming from. That's where the mass control is coming from. And that's also why they wish to infect the whole world with their own particular kind of virus. And my message then is almost like that of a homeopathic doctor, is what can we do to not only diagnose this problem, but then what can we do to, homeopathically remedy it? And of course the answer is to strengthen your own immune system. Not physical immune system, but in this case, psychic immunity. And you can't do that without addressing the subject of psychology. And that is why I'm one of the first people to blend the conspiratorial, the phenomena, the studies that we have in conspiracy, and sort of bring consciousness back in instead of leaving it at the door. It's very, very important because this pathology does exist in these people. They are not lovers of freedom. They are not lovers of liberty. They deal in genocide. They have dealt in genocide. What we're talking about here is absolutely documented fact. These are not healthy people. And especially another most important point is that these individuals, though they may be in a nation or they may be ruling a certain country, never let us make the mistake, that they actually belong to that country or care at all about the people in that country. This goes for the royal families. It's often said, the Queen of England or the Duke of Belgium or something like that, or the Kaiser of Germany or what have you. You know what I mean? But this is actually another symptom of mind control. None of these royal families give a damn about the countries in which they come. The only reason why they're in those countries is to send the poor people of those countries off to die in wars for their benefit. The royalists are globalists. They've always been globalist. That's why they talk about, as you said, the one world order, because one world order is what they're all about. They are on the planet Earth for the subjugation of all mankind. It doesn't matter if it's Emperor Hirohito over here or some, other potentate over there. As far as they're concerned, that is purely, for the propaganda purposes to keep people waving flags and thinking that, these people really care at all about the people in that country. And this is why the Windsor family, for instance, changed their name. The name of Windsor